Hi everyone, Tim here to take you through study 5 of our Matthew series, King Jesus, the Call of the King. This study is entitled The Kingdom in Action, David's Messiah, and the aim of this story is to invite us to recognize Jesus as the expected Messiah, bringing about the promised kingdom for God's people on earth as it is in heaven, like he promised in his Sermon on the Mount. So let's take a look at how that happens. Remember that where we are in Matthew's Gospel is Jesus has come down from the Sermon on the Mount, and now we are starting to see that kingdom that he proclaimed in action. You may remember from study 1, we looked at the way that the miracles in this section of Matthew's Gospel can be broken into 9. And in study 1, we did this first kind of triplet of miracles. We've slowed down a little bit as we've looked at Jesus' authority in these second 3 miracles. And now what we're going to do in one study is look at these final 3 miracles together. This one over here is kind of a 2 for the price of 1 miracle. And what we're going to find is all of these miracles come back to what Jesus has proclaimed in his Sermon on the Mount, but also what we are finding out about Jesus and what Matthew has already told us about Jesus. 1, that he is a God with us, and 2, that he is the one who is going to come and rescue God's people. And so we've had to make decisions as we've prepared these studies to focus on certain aspects just to make it a simpler study. So particularly in this first set, in our first study, we focused on Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us, the clean coming into the space of the unclean, and instead of becoming unclean himself, making them clean. But we could have equally have looked at Jesus' identity as Messiah, as we looked at those first 3. The second 3, we've kind of looked at individually at what they tell us about Jesus' authority. And this final set of 3, we could focus on Jesus as Emmanuel, and we'll see that in a moment. But we've decided to specifically look at this idea of Jesus as the promised Messiah, and we'll see how that works out in a moment. Let's remind ourselves about what we mean when we talk about Jesus as Messiah. So God's people knew that God had promised to King David in 2 Samuel 7 that a king from his line would be appointed by God to be their forever ruler. And there was this expectation around this forever ruler that he would establish a kingdom of peace and justice and restoration. We could go to any number of places in the Old Testament to see some of the expectations around this promised rescuer. But in the group guide, we've suggested looking specifically at Isaiah 35 as one example of the expectations around this Messiah that ties in really well with what we're going to be looking at in Matthew. These expectations created something of what you could almost term a messianic checklist or brand. And so God's people knew that the coming of the Messiah would be marked by certain events. And so we can see this in Isaiah 35, for instance, just to bring it out. When the Messiah comes, the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, the lame will leap, the mute will speak, water will gush forth in the deserts, sand will become a pool, and where jackals once lay, grass, reeds, and papyrus will grow. We'll actually see this a little bit later on in Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus refers back to this sort of messianic checklist to comfort John and help him to think through whether Jesus really is the Messiah or not. So we'll get this a little bit later, but look here in Matthew 11, where Jesus says, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, tick. The lame walk, tick. Those who have leprosy are cleansed, tick. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." And so Jesus points to this checklist to say to John, you're wondering whether the Messiah is here or not? Well, think about what you expect of when the Messiah comes, and then think of what you're seeing in my actions. And this is important because as we look at this passage, what we're going to find, along with the miracles we've already seen, is that Jesus is one by one ticking off these messianic expectations. And so our structure for this passage is, firstly, we see the dead being raised, and sort of sandwiched in that story, we've got another story of the lowly being healed. The blind are given sight, and the mute speaks. And so we're going to see this operating sort of as a brand checklist. This is what we should expect from the Messiah. So let's look at that first story, the dead are raised. Here, a synagogue leader comes, kneels before Jesus, and asks him to come and resurrect his dead daughter. The first thing to notice is this, like the centurion in chapter 8, is a powerful man who comes and humbles himself before Jesus. He kneels before Jesus and asks him to raise his daughter to life. And it is worth pausing here and just realizing what a big request this is. And so it's very easy, because we talk about Jesus' resurrection and Jesus raises people from life in the Gospels, to just brush over how big a miracle this man is asking for. There are only a couple of instances in the Old Testament where the dead are raised to life, only amongst God's greatest prophets, Elijah and Elisha. So this is not a common thing to expect from God's person, the raising of the dead. So it is a very big request that the leader is making. And Jesus gets up and goes, and on the way, he encounters a woman who's been subjected to bleeding for 12 years. Now, the fact that she's a woman and sort of the innuendo of the passage has led many to suggest that this is a menstrual bleeding, in which case this woman is someone who's perpetually unclean, which draws us back to what we learned in study 1. We've got another encounter here of the ultimate clean person, God with us, coming into contact with someone who should never be able to come into contact with God. She says to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turns and sees her, exactly the encounter she was trying to avoid, but he doesn't rebuke her. Instead, he says, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. And so that's the example of how we could have equally focused on the idea of Jesus as Emmanuel. But here, looking through the lens of Jesus as Messiah, we see him, like the Sermon on the Mount, coming for the meek and the humble and the lowly. And we come back to the resurrection story of this little girl, and we find Jesus entering the synagogue's house and sending the noisy crowd and people playing pipes away. This tells us a couple of things. Firstly, that this girl is already dead, so the appropriate mourners have come in, but also it raises an interesting question about what is Jesus doing here. And so there's two possible explanations. One we could say is that he is deliberately trying to decrease the attention that this miracle is going to bring about. So he is sending these people away so that the news of what he's done is sort of reduced. And we've seen this potentially with the man with leprosy. We're going to see it in a moment with the blind man, and we're going to see it later on in Matthew's Gospel, where people tells those he's healed not to go and report what he's done. And we are going to answer the question as to why he does that next term when we come to Matthew 12. But another possible explanation is that the reason Jesus sends them away is because he says mourning is actually not appropriate for what's going on, in the sense that this girl is asleep, she is going to come back to life. And so the kind of mourning that they're about to do, well, it's a little bit silly, because in a moment, this girl is going to be getting up. And so Jesus raises her to life, which leaves us thinking at the end, is this a great miracle, a sign of a great prophet on par with Elijah and Elisha? Or is it an indication that someone greater than even those great prophets is now here? The next story we come to is that of the blind seeing. Two blind men follow Jesus and call out to him, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." The Son of David links back to what we've said about the Messiah coming from 2 Samuel 7. And it just goes to show that these men knew their messianic expectations. They knew that when the Son of David came, the blind would be given sight. And so they call out, "Son of David," looking for that association, hoping that Jesus is this one who's going to bring sight to the blind. And Jesus asks them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" So people like the centurion in chapter 8 and the ruler have already indicated by their faith, by kneeling before Jesus, by requesting him to do the thing, that they believe that he can do it. Where it seems that perhaps these blind men are a little bit more speculative. They are just hoping. And so what Jesus asks for them is more than just hope. He wants to know, do they have faith that Jesus can restore their sight. And so, yes, Lord, they reply. And Jesus says, according to your faith, let it be done to you. This doesn't mean according to the proportion of faith or the quality of faith, but simply it means that because they have believed, because they've demonstrated this faith that Jesus can do it, their request is granted. Here again, we find Jesus warning them sternly, see that no one knows about this. But despite this, they go out and spread the news about him throughout the region, which raises the question again, why is it that Jesus is hiding his identity as Messiah? We're going to come again to that in chapter 12. And so it is a question to keep in the back of your mind until then. Finally, we come to the mute who speaks. There was a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk, who was brought to Jesus. When the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. The word for mute or could not talk here is kophos. I think that's how you said, excuse my Greek, which essentially means, or it can mean mute, as in unable to speak, or deaf, or a combination of those things. So you are mute because you are deaf. Certainly this man was mute because he was not able to speak, but it's very possible that he was deaf-mute. And if so, interestingly, these stories put together match Isaiah 35 perfectly, in that we've got the eyes of the blind open and then the ears of the deaf unstopped immediately afterwards. And so it could very well be that Matthew is putting these stories together to make us see these messianic expectations being ticked off one by one. Finally, this passage ends with two contrasting reactions. The first one is by the crowd, who are amazed, and they say, nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel. And the second is the Pharisees, who say, well, it must be by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. Well, what's interesting is both of these admit that Jesus is unique in the sense that even amongst a nation with a history of miracle workers, Moses and Elijah and Elisha, Jesus is something completely new. And the Pharisees, although they're not ready to admit Jesus' divine authority, even they go, well, there's something special about this man. He must be connected with the prince of demons in the way that what he does is so special. We want people to walk away with two things, really. The first is what I've kind of called Messiah hype. That is to say that this idea that Jesus is the Messiah as he fulfills this checklist or this brand is a reason to get excited. And those with these messianic expectations would have seen what Jesus is doing and get more and more excited as they see him meet their expectations, and particularly about everything else that he's promised to achieve, a kingdom of peace and justice and prosperity. And so these stories are very, very exciting, and they should be for us too. And then the second thing is to look forward and consider how, first of all, we have a reason to worship Jesus because of these things. But as we look to him and his death on the cross and see the foundation of that kingdom of justice and peace and what it cost him and how he achieved it, it gives us even more reason to be excited about Jesus as the Messiah of Israel and of us, and to worship him all the more.